Hi folks, Mr. Long here. I'm going to do a quick review of factoring trinomials. We'll start it with some simple trinomials, stuff that you've been doing since grade 10. And I just want to go over really just some basic number sense. And because these are things that you can do when you're factoring that will really speed up the process, okay? If you're just guessing and checking and you may not, have your times tables down perfectly, and that's it is what it is, right? Although you can always get better. You may want to use some more efficient strategies. First thing I'm going to suggest is always have a multiplication chart in front of you. Remember that there's one on the back of your formula sheet. So if you don't have your formula, your times tables down to 12 times 12 from just quick recall, then you definitely want to have that formula sheet in front of you. You'll learn much more working off a multiplication chart than you will just typing numbers in your calculator. Okay, so some basic ideas. What happens when you have a large negative right here plus a small positive? Say negative 10 plus 4. Well, your answer is always going to be negative, right? Because the negative is bigger in absolute value size compared to the 4. What about a large positive? What about 10 plus a small negative? Negative 4. Well, what are you going to get? It's going to be a positive because the absolute size of the 10 is much bigger than the 4 that's negative. Even odd numbers. This is something that's actually really helpful. Even plus even, like 4 plus 4 is 8. So if you add two even numbers together, what do you always get? Another even number. What about odd plus odd? That's an interesting one that you may not have thought about. 3 plus 3, 6. 5 plus 5, 10. And that's because if you think about that, so what's the proof for that? Well, you're doing two groups of 3. You're doing two groups of 5. 2, the definition of an even number is if 2 is a factor. So you're doing two groups. So it has to be even, okay? It has to be even. Then the last one, which is really, so in other words, if I give you a number that, like, so I say two numbers are added together and the answer is 12. You can't tell if the numbers were both even or both odd, right? It could be one or the other. On the other hand, though, when you add an even and an odd number, you always get an odd number. Right? 11 plus 2. 11's odd, 2's even, 13. So if I know that two numbers add up to, say, 17, one of them had to be even and one of them had to be odd. Okay, what about multiplication? Even times an even, 4 times 4, 16. That makes sense. What about even times an odd? Well, again, any even number has 2 as a factor. Okay, 10, 2 times 5. 30, 2 times 15. 8, 2 times 4. If 2 is multiplied by anything, it becomes an even number, okay? It becomes an even number. So, oh, that's wrong. That should say even. Sorry, folks. Even times an odd is an even. Now, what about an odd times an odd? Odd times an odd is going to be an odd number. Okay, odd times an odd, like 3 times 3. Okay, that'll be 9. 7 times 7, 49. What about 3 times 5? That's 15, okay? So the product of two odd numbers is always odd. And then we finally get into our multiplication rules. Positive times a positive is a positive. Negative times a negative is a positive. And a positive times a negative, though, is a negative. Okay? The other thing that we can go into is common factoring, right? We always common factor first. So let's look at this example here. If I want to common factor this, negative 3x squared plus 21x minus 36, is there a common factor? Well, I'd have to look at my multiplication chart, right? And I know, first thing I'm going to look for is 3, see if 3 is a common factor. So I look at my multiplication chart and I go across the row with a 3 on it. 21. Does 21 appear in that row? Because the row goes 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21. So yeah, 3 is a factor of 21, and it goes in 7 times. If I kept going, I would find that 36 also has 3 as a factor. So my common factor in this case, I always factor out a leading negative, so I'm going to factor out the negative 3 there. What is factoring? It's division, right? So when I say when I'm factoring something, I'm dividing by that number and multiplying by that number. If I multiply a number by, say, 2, and I divide by 2, is it still worth 5? For sure. That's all factoring does, is it takes something that's expressed by adding or subtracting and turning it into, at least part of it, into multiplication. I can't change the quantity, right? 5 equals 5. But I sure can write it as like 10 over 2, right? That's still 5. It's just a different way of writing 5. The same thing holds true for algebra. If negative 3 is a common factor, I multiply everything by negative 3, but at the same time I have to divide everything by negative 3 to keep quantity, to maintain quantity, to preserve the quantity. So then I just divide everything by negative 3. Okay, so negative 3 divided by negative 3, 1. 21 divided by negative 3, negative 7. Negative 36 divided by negative 3, 2 negatives divides out to a positive 12. Once I do that, folks, then it would be easy. Okay, now we're actually going to factor 1, okay? Now we're actually going to factor 1. And I know I'm going through this fairly quickly. I'm reviewing basic rules, but I really would encourage you to go over this, maybe write some notes down and things like that. So I'm not going to go through the basics of why these patterns work. You've learned that in previous years. Suffice to say that when you have ax squared plus bx plus c, where the number out front here is a 1, that the two numbers that you're going to get, you're looking for two numbers that add up to negative 9 or have a sum of negative 9 and multiply to negative 22. Now, how do you go about analyzing this? Well, I think you need to look at even odd and the signs, right? So negative 9, what kind of a number is that? A negative number, but it's also an odd number. Now look at this one, negative 22, a negative number and even. So let's think about this. So what about the negative in the middle? What does that mean? If I have a negative in the middle, what does that mean? It means that I have either two negatives or one negative and one positive. What does the negative mean at the end? Oh, I have a negative multiplied by a positive. I have a negative multiplied by a positive. So let me just look at this. So what would this tell us? This negative in the middle, that it's negative plus a negative or a big negative plus a smaller positive. That's what it tells me. The negative in terms of multiplication means I've got a negative multiplied by a positive. So now I can say, okay, that's true, then it must be this one here. Okay, it must be this one here. You're not going to do this. Like, this is something that you got to move to a point of automaticity, right? You're not going to write all this out every time. And then what you need to think about is, well, actually that's enough. You know now, you've got a negative times a positive, and the negative is bigger. So what I do, I don't worry then anymore about the sign in front of the 22. I just go, what things multiply to 22? Well, in this case, 22 and 1 and 2 and 11. Well, 2 and 11, which one has to be negative? The bigger one, because it adds up to negative 9. Okay, so it's going to be negative 11 and positive 2. Okay, and I've summarized all that over here. Okay, there we go, folks. So it's going to be x minus 11 and x plus 2. And if I had to solve the equation, I would get 11 and negative 2. Please remember, if you're using a calculator that has like a quadratic solver or a polysolve feature in it, please remember that it doesn't give you the negative 11 that goes in the factor form. It actually gives you the roots, okay, of 11 and negative 2. Okay, folks, so that's how you factor simple trinomials, they call them. So a simple trinomial means that's 1 in front of x squared. Okay, folks, so pause, well, You're through it, so review it as you need. Take notes as you need it. Oh, and you know what? I'm going to leave this right here. You might want to pause the video right now and try that one. X squared plus 8x minus 65. There's your answer, but try to factor x squared plus 8x minus 65. And again, the thinking is, look at that. The two numbers have to multiply to an odd number. What kind of numbers multiply to an odd number? Two odd numbers. The only things that multiply to an odd are two odds. So right away, think about that for a second. You know they're both odds. So what does that tell you? It tells you that you can get rid of half of all numbers, right? You've just removed 50% of possible numbers that multiply together to get 65, right? 50%, okay? Because half of all numbers are odd and half of all numbers are even. Just knowing that two numbers that multiply, that are odd, that multiply, just knowing that both numbers are odd is really helpful, okay? And again, they have to add up to positive 8 so that what does that mean? If they add to a positive 8, that means the negative is bigger, or the positive is bigger, rather. Okay, so go ahead, try that one, pause, and then check, your answers there. All right, so good luck and happy factoring.